The rhythmic clack of keys on his keyboard was the most consistent sound in Reid's life, a steady, predictable pulse. He sat hunched over a spreadsheet, columns of figures blurring into a monotonous pattern. His desk was a monument to order, pens aligned, papers stacked in precise, labeled folders, a single, unblemished mug holding lukewarm coffee. Reid found comfort in such exactitude, in the certainty that if he followed the rules, the outcome would be precisely as expected. His days unfolded like a perfectly constructed algorithm, each step logical, each result quantifiable. He was a man of routine, a determined architect of his own quiet, unremarkable existence. Then the phone rang. It wasn't a client, nor a colleague. The voice on the other end was formal, crisp, belonging to a legal representative. "Mr. Vance," the voice inquired, and Reid corrected him, "It's Reid." The name, he realized, was a variation on his own, a distant echo from a forgotten branch of his lineage. The representative explained, with a detached professionalism that grated against Reid's meticulous calm, that a distant relative, one he barely remembered existing, had passed away. There were no closer kin. Reid was the sole inheritor. The inheritance wasn't money, nor a city apartment, nor anything remotely useful to Reid's structured life. It was a cabin. An old cabin. Deep within a forest that, according to the legal representative's dry recitation, was largely unmapped. Secluded. Ancient. Reid felt a tremor of something alien, a faint discord in the ordered symphony of his life. He found himself agreeing to take possession, a decision driven less by curiosity and more by a strange, almost compulsive need to tie up loose ends, even those he hadn't known existed. The legal representative provided a set of tarnished brass keys and a hand-drawn map that looked less like a guide and more like a warning. The journey began with the familiar drone of highway traffic, a final farewell to the world Reid understood. As he drove, the asphalt lanes narrowed, shedding their smooth, predictable surface for the cracked, uneven sprawl of forgotten county roads. The towering glass and steel of the city skyline receded into a hazy smudge in his rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills that soon gave way to denser, more encroaching woodlands. The air, once thick with exhaust fumes, began to carry the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The silence grew, not the comfortable hush of his apartment, but a vast, expectant quiet. He remembered passing a truly derelict, abandoned lighthouse on a jutting promontory, its lens long shattered, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its skeletal frame a stark silhouette against a bruised sky. It felt like the last vestige of human endeavor, a lonely sentinel guarding the entrance to a place where time itself seemed to sag and buckle. After that, the road turned definitively inland, plunging deeper into the wilderness. The trees grew taller, their branches knitting together overhead, forming a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the afternoon. Sunlight became a scarce commodity, filtering down in weak, fractured shafts that dappled the forest floor with shifting, spectral patterns. The paved road finally dissolved into a track of compacted earth and gravel, barely wide enough for his vehicle. Branches scraped against the paintwork, a constant, abrasive whisper. The further he drove, the more the forest seemed to press in, a living, breathing entity with a palpable presence. He felt small, insignificant, a foreign object in a world that had forgotten the touch of human hands. His precise internal compass began to waver, the logical pathways of his mind blurring under the weight of the encroaching primeval gloom. Then, through a sudden thinning in the canopy, he saw it. The cabin wasn't quaint, or rustic, or charming. Moss clung to its rough-hewn logs like a second skin, and the single window on the visible side was a black, vacant eye staring out from under a heavy brow of eaves. A skeletal porch sagged precariously, its posts groaning silently under an unseen burden. Reid cut the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, suffocating. He hadn't realized how tense he'd become until the pressure eased, only to be replaced by a deeper, more pervasive unease. He stepped out onto the overgrown drive, the crunch of dry leaves under his boots an almost sacrilegious intrusion. The scent of decay was stronger here, a mix of damp wood, forgotten earth, and something else, something subtly acrid, like old iron and undisturbed dust. He walked towards the cabin, his steps hesitant, each one echoing in the heavy quiet. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, teeming with an unseen presence that pressed against his skin, prickling the hairs on his arms. Splinters dug into his palm, a sharp, unwelcome reminder of physical reality. He hesitated, then pushed the largest key into the lock. It scraped, resisted, then with a reluctant groan, turned. The click, when it finally came, sounded like a bone breaking in the profound stillness of the forest. Reid pushed the door open. His logical mind screamed for light, for a switch, for any familiar comfort. The determination that usually anchored him felt flimsy, stretched thin, threatening to snap. He stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft, final sigh. The cabin air, thick with the scent of aged wood and damp earth, was a stark contrast to the sterile office he'd left behind. Reid moved with a purpose, a determined frown etched between his brows. He'd spent the last 2 days trying to impose his own brand of order on the chaos of the cabin, a futile effort against decades of dust and disuse. He attacked the grime with a vigor born of necessity, sweeping cobwebs from high corners, wiping down surfaces that hadn't seen a cloth in years. He stacked forgotten books into neat piles, sorted rusty tools, and cleared pathways through rooms choked with forgotten furniture draped in white sheets that now looked more like shrouds. He told himself the creaks were just the old timbers settling, the groans the wind wrestling with ancient eaves. The cabin was a living thing, he reasoned, breathing and shifting with the elements. It began subtly. A faint scratching sound, like claws on wood, that seemed to emanate from the wall beside his bed. He'd paused, holding his breath, listening. Nothing. He dismissed it as a mouse, an industrious beetle. The cabin was old, after all, and likely home to more than just dust bunnies. He spun around, his heart giving a small, unwelcome lurch. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim, late afternoon light filtering through a grimy window. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Fatigue, he decided. The long drive, the endless cleaning, the sheer effort of adjusting to this isolated existence. His mind was playing tricks. He found a small, tarnished silver locket on the floor of the living room, nestled against the leg of a heavy armchair. He was certain he'd seen it on the mantelpiece earlier that day, a small, unremarkable trinket amidst a collection of ceramic figurines. He picked it up, the cold metal surprisingly heavy in his palm, and placed it back on the mantelpiece, making a mental note of its exact position. A few hours later, after a meager dinner of canned soup, he returned to the living room to read. The locket was gone. He searched, his gaze sweeping the floor, checking under the armchair, even behind the other trinkets. It was nowhere. He felt a prickle of unease, a sensation he quickly quashed. He must have misplaced it, or put it in a different spot without thinking. His determination to bring order to the cabin was absolute. and he wouldn't let such minor oddities derail him. The next morning, driven by a need to understand the cabin's layout better, Reid ventured into a small, seldom-used room off the kitchen. It was cramped, windowless, and smelled strongly of mildew and something metallic. He suspected it was a pantry or storage area. He pulled aside a heavy, moth-eaten curtain that hung across one wall, revealing a crudely constructed set of shelves. On the highest shelf, tucked behind a stack of rusted tins, he found it, a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth, its pages yellowed and brittle. It felt ancient, heavy with secrets. He carefully extracted it, the leather creaking in protest. As he carried it into the brighter kitchen light, a small, folded piece of parchment slipped from between its pages and fluttered to the floor. He knelt, picking it up. It was a faded, hand-drawn map, intricately detailed, showing a winding path through dense forest. His gaze traced the faint, almost erased lines. At the very edge of the parchment, where the forest met what appeared to be a rough coastline, a small, distinctive symbol was sketched, the unmistakable silhouette of an abandoned lighthouse. He hadn't known there was a lighthouse anywhere near this forgotten patch of land. The map, he realized, was not of the immediate cabin surroundings, but of a wider, more desolate area, further west. The journal, he hoped, might shed some light on its purpose. He opened the journal to the first page, the brittle paper crackling. The handwriting was spidery, precise, and immediately unsettling. The opening entry was dated over a century ago. The pact is made. The blood spilled. The burden accepted. May the light guide us, and the depths hold our secrets. Pact? Blood? Burden? And the tower's eye, a clear reference to the lighthouse. He glanced at the map again, then back at the journal. This wasn't just an old relative's eccentric ramblings. This was something else entirely. He wasn't just in an old house, he was in a house that held history, a history that felt suddenly, terrifyingly alive. The journal lay open on the warped kitchen table, its brittle pages whispering secrets Reid wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Pact. Blood. Burden. The words looped in his mind, a discordant melody. He traced the rough lines of the map, his finger hovering over the crude drawing of the distant, abandoned lighthouse. A cold knot tightened in his stomach, the same one that had been there since he first stepped foot in this secluded cabin. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize the unease. The cabin was old, naturally prone to creaks and groans. Yet, the sounds had grown bolder, more deliberate. Earlier, a book had slid from a shelf in the main room, landing with a soft thud. Reid had blamed the uneven floorboards, a vibration from his own heavy footsteps. But he hadn't been near the shelf. He'd sniffed the air, confused, then waved a hand through it, trying to dispel the phantom odor. It only intensified the prickle on his skin. That evening, as twilight bled through the grimy window panes, the phenomena intensified. Reid sat at the kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm mug of coffee, trying to decipher more of his distant relative's cryptic scrawls. The cabin was settling into its usual evening symphony of groans, but a new note had been added. A rhythmic tap. Tap. Tap emanated from the ceiling directly above him. Not a branch hitting the roof, he was certain. This was too precise, too even. He craned his neck, listening. The tapping stopped the moment he focused on it, only to resume from a different corner of the room, a faint scratch. scratch. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding thin and absurdly small in the encroaching gloom. He walked over to the wall, pressing his ear against the rough timber. The scratching ceased. He pulled back, frustration bubbling. This wasn't just an old house playing tricks. This was aware. Later, huddled under a thick, scratchy wool blanket, Reid tried to sleep. The sounds persisted, not constant, but intermittent, like a presence testing his resolve. He could no longer rationalize these occurrences. The cabin wasn't just old, it was alive with something he couldn't comprehend. The initial searches yielded little beyond standard property records and regional maps. He broadened his scope, searching for local legends, historical anecdotes about the forest, anything remotely unusual. Hours blurred. He found a digitized collection of old newspaper clippings from a tiny, defunct local paper. Most were mundane, but a few caught his eye. An article from the late 1800s mentioned a string of unexplained disappearances in the forest, hikers, a prospector, even a few local trappers. The article spoke of the deep wood's strange pull and the land's ancient claim. Another, from the 1920s, detailed a fire that consumed a small, isolated settlement deep in the forest, not far from where the cabin stood. His distant relative's family name, an uncommon one, began to appear in the periphery of these fragmented histories. Not directly involved in the disappearances or the fire. Often mentioned as the owners of vast tracts of the surrounding forest, known for their reclusive nature and their strict adherence to old traditions. One faded clipping, barely legible, spoke of a local dispute over land rights, with a distant ancestor refusing to sell a specific plot, citing a covenant with the earth itself. Reid's gaze kept returning to the journal, to the tower's eye. He typed "abandoned lighthouse" into his search bar, adding the name of the nearest coastal town. He found historical records indicating it had been decommissioned over a century ago, deemed unsafe. But then he found something else, an obscure local history forum. A thread from years ago discussed the lighthouse, not for its maritime history, but for its unusual construction. An anonymous poster had claimed it was built not as a beacon for ships, but as a marker, a ward, or even a cage for something on the land. The post was dismissed as crackpot theory by others, but one reply stood out, cryptic and unsettling: "Some eyes watch the sea. Others watch the forest." He looked from the laptop screen, with its image of the desolate lighthouse, to the map in the journal, then back to the words, "packed." Burden. The pieces weren't fitting together neatly, but they were beginning to form a horrifying outline. The cold dread that had seeped into Reid's bones twisted into a hard knot in his gut. The laptop screen, the desolate image of the lighthouse, the journal's crude map, and the stark words, "packed." Burden spun a web around him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that the answers lay there, in that forgotten sentinel on the coast. He had to go. The drive was long, the road narrowing from a gravel track to little more than a deer path as it wound deeper into the coastal woods. The trees here were different, gnarled and salt-blasted, their branches clawing at the perpetually overcast sky. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine and decaying leaves. Reid's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. When the tree line finally broke, it revealed a desolate stretch of rocky coastline, battered by an unforgiving sea. And there it stood, stark against the gray horizon, the abandoned lighthouse. It was taller than he'd imagined, a skeletal finger pointing towards a sky that offered no comfort. Its white paint had long since peeled, leaving behind a mottled, gray-black facade stained with lichen and salt. The lantern room at the top was a gaping maw of broken glass, like a blind eye staring out at the churning waves. He stepped out of the vehicle, the crunch of his boots on the shingle loud in the vast emptiness. The air tasted like rust and salt. He approached the lighthouse cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick with the dust of ages, a fine grit that coated everything. He could taste it, dry and metallic, on his tongue. The spiral staircase was made of rough-hewn timber, its steps worn smooth in the center, groaning under his weight with every ascent. He ascended slowly, his breath catching in his throat, his heart thrumming against his ribs like a trapped bird. Midway up, a peculiar detail caught his eye. A section of the wall, unlike the rest, seemed almost too regular, too smooth. He ran. His fingers over it, feeling a faint seam, barely perceptible beneath layers of grime and dampness. He pushed, gently at first, then with more force. Inside, nestled in the dust and cobwebs, was a small, leather-bound box. It was old, its leather cracked and brittle, secured with a tarnished brass clasp. His hands trembled as he unlatched it. Within, not a single journal, but a sheaf of aged, brittle parchment, tied with a faded ribbon. The paper was thin, almost translucent, covered in a precise, looping script that was eerily familiar, the same hand as the notes in the cabin's journal. He carefully extracted the top sheet. He began to read, his voice a low whisper in the echoing chamber of the lighthouse. August 14, 1872. The burden grows heavier with each passing year. The land demands its due, and the pact, once a desperate plea, is now a suffocating shroud. Our ancestor, in his folly, sought to bind the ancient spirit of this place, to tame the wild sorrow that festered beneath the earth where the old ones lay. He believed he could harness its power, protect his line, ensure prosperity for generations. Reid swallowed, a dry rasp in his throat. His ancestor. His line. The words swam before his eyes, yet he couldn't tear his gaze away. The ritual was performed here, on this very point, where the land meets the crushing waves, a place of convergence. A conduit. The blood was spilled, the vows made. The spirit, however, was not to be tamed. Only bound. Bound to the earth, to the cabin built upon its sacred soil, and to the bloodline that sealed the pact. The entity. It was tied to the land, to his family. He continued, his eyes scanning the brittle pages, piecing together the horrifying mosaic. The pact wasn't a protection, it was a curse. A trade. The ancestor had offered his descendants as anchors, as vessels, to contain and placate the malevolent force that lay beneath the cabin. Each generation was meant to maintain the balance, to offer something of themselves, a living sacrifice of peace, or risk the entity breaking free, consuming everything. Its light, in the early years, was meant to project a barrier, a symbolic ward. But the spirit grows restless. It seeks to break its chains, to reclaim its ancient power, to feed without limit. And it will start with the one whose blood runs purest, the one who inherited the land. The current keeper of the burden. Reid's breath hitched. He was the next link in a chain of sacrifice. The cabin wasn't just manifesting phenomena, it was a prison, and he was the latest captive. The entity wasn't just haunting the cabin, it was the cabin, or rather, it was bound to it, drawing strength from him. He wasn't just reading history, he was reading his own grim fate. He had found the truth, and the truth was a sentence. Reid's breath, ragged and shallow, sawed through the silence of the cabin. The current keeper of the burden. The words echoed in the hollow space behind his eyes, a cold, hard knot tightening in his gut. He looked around the main room, seeing it not as a rustic inheritance but as a cage, its timbers gnawed by unseen forces, its very air thick with anticipation. The entity wasn't just a lingering presence, it was the house, its ancient timbers and settling foundations now pulsing with a malevolent life. A low, guttural thrum began to vibrate through the floorboards beneath his feet. It wasn't the natural groan of old wood, it was deeper, more resonant, like the slow, deliberate pulse of something immense buried just beneath the surface. He took a step back, bumping into the rough-hewn table. A stack of yellowed papers, forgotten by a previous generation, slid to the floor with a papery rustle. As he bent to retrieve them, the hum intensified, vibrating up his spine, making his teeth ache. Welcome, Keeper. Reid clutched his head, a searing pain lancing behind his eyes. It was a voice, yet it wasn't. It was thought, pure and invasive, worming its way into his consciousness, twisting his own internal monologue into something alien and menacing. He stumbled back again, his hand scraping against the cold stone of the fireplace. The flames in the hearth roared suddenly, leaping high, momentarily blinding him with their intensity before dying down to mere embers, as if mocking his fear. He needed to get out. He lunged for the front door, his fingers fumbling for the cold metal latch. It was stuck. He pulled, he pushed, he rattled it with increasing desperation, but the door remained stubbornly shut, as if fused with the frame. The screen flickered, displaying only static, a swirling vortex of black and white. He threw it against the wall in frustration, the plastic casing cracking with a pathetic snap. The cabin seemed to sigh in response, a long, drawn-out sound that scraped against his nerves. He turned, his gaze sweeping the room, desperately searching for an escape, a window, anything. Not in the room itself, but projected onto the far wall, shimmering like a mirage. It was an image, stark and terrifying, of an abandoned lighthouse. The stone tower stood against a churning, gray sea, waves crashing against its base with vicious intent. And at the very top, silhouetted against a bruised, purple sky, was a figure. A small, familiar figure. It was the friend he'd spoken to just days ago, the one who'd helped him with the initial paperwork for the cabin. This wasn't a hallucination born of stress, it was a deliberate, targeted attack. The entity was showing him, threatening him, making him understand the reach of its power. It wasn't just confined to the cabin, it could touch those he cared about, warp their reality, or worse. Those who touched the keeper. They too may be drawn. The image of the lighthouse began to bleed, the stone walls dissolving into streaks of gray and black, the friend's screaming face elongating, twisting, becoming something monstrous and indistinct. The cabin itself groaned, the very walls seeming to ripple. The wooden beams overhead warped and straightened, groaning like sinews under immense strain. The air grew impossibly thick, pressing down on him, stealing his breath. This was it. Every exit was sealed, every connection to the outside world severed. He was alone, utterly and irrevocably, within walls that pulsed with ancient hunger. The revelation of the lighthouse, and the threat it represented, was not just a warning, it was a promise. A promise that the pack demanded more than just a keeper, it demanded an isolation so profound, it would break him. Reid felt the cabin's ancient, insidious presence beginning to seep into his very bones, twisting his perceptions, blurring the line between his own thoughts and the entity's insidious will. He was no longer just in the cabin, he was becoming a part of it, absorbed into its terrible, timeless purpose. The image dissolved, bleeding from the crude screen of his laptop into the very air of the cabin, leaving behind a residue of terror. Reid stumbled back, his spine scraping against the rough-hewn wall, the wood vibrating with a low, resonant hum that seemed to originate from the earth itself. The cabin wasn't just groaning, it was breathing. Each inhale was a creak of ancient beams, each exhale a sigh of dust and decay that settled on his tongue like grit. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to purge the sight of his friend's monstrous, twisting face, the dissolving stone of the abandoned lighthouse. No. He wouldn't let it consume him. Not yet. He clawed for his phone, fumbling it from his pocket. The screen remained stubbornly dark. Nothing. Dead. He slammed it onto the rough-hewn table, the cheap plastic clattering. He needed to get out. Reid lunged for the front door, yanking at the heavy iron latch. He pulled harder, throwing his weight against it, the muscles in his shoulders screaming. The door, which had always opened with a groan and a sigh, was now a solid, unyielding barrier. He could hear a faint scratching from the other side, like skeletal fingers skittering across the wood, or perhaps just the wind playing a cruel trick. The windows. The glass, thick and grimy, reflected his own wide, desperate eyes. He raised the poker, then hesitated. What if breaking the glass invited something in? What if the forest itself was waiting, watching? He moved to the back door, the one that led to a small, overgrown path toward what he thought was the old logging road. This one gave way with a shuddering creak, revealing a sliver of twilight gloom. The air was frigid, biting at his exposed skin. He stepped out, onto the porch, the rotting wood groaning beneath his weight. The path, usually a faint but discernible track, had vanished. Or rather, it had shifted. The air was still, unnaturally so, yet he could hear a faint, persistent hiss that seemed to emanate from the very ground, a sound like dry leaves scuttling across stone. Twigs snapped underfoot. Invisible branches clawed at his face, leaving stinging welts. He kept his gaze fixed on where he thought the sun had set, a faint promise of direction. But the forest twisted around him, a living, breathing labyrinth. He called out again, louder this time, a raw cry of fear and frustration. No answer. Only the hissing, and now, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. Not the cabin. Not the logging road. But the abandoned lighthouse. It stood stark against the bruised twilight sky, its stone tower impossibly tall, unnervingly close. A beacon, yes, but one that pulsed with an unholy, sickly yellow light, not the comforting sweep of a maritime lamp. It wasn't just an image anymore, it was there. A wave of nausea washed over him. How? He had been walking away from it, or so he thought. He had been walking in a circle, or the forest had made him walk in a circle. The lighthouse, impossibly near, yet still distant enough to mock his efforts, seemed to beckon him. He stumbled towards it, drawn by a morbid curiosity, a flicker of hope that perhaps there, at the source of the vision, he might find answers. He pushed through a thicket of thorns, their sharp points tearing at his jacket, his skin. He was getting closer. The ground beneath his feet shifted, becoming rocky, uneven. He reached a clearing, a small, desolate expanse of gray stone and stunted, wind-whipped grass. And there it was, directly in front of him, looming. The lighthouse was not as he remembered it from the pictures, not a grand, stoic sentinel. Its stone was crumbling, scarred with black streaks that looked like dried tears. The lantern room at the top was shattered, a gaping maw of broken glass and rusted metal. And then, he saw it. Not carved, but almost etched into the stone, as if by corrosive acid, was a symbol. A spiral, not a perfect one, but one that seemed to coil inward upon itself, like a serpent devouring its own tail. And beneath it, almost illegible, a single word, pactum. This wasn't just a lighthouse, it was a monument, a marker. A place where something had been made, something ancient and terrible. The blood-like streaks, the pervasive smell of decay, the impossible proximity. This was a focal point. This was where it began. He stared at the symbol, the word, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a horrifying finality. The distant relative's death, the cabin, the twisting reality, all connected to this place, this pactum. The entity wasn't just claiming the cabin, it was claiming the lineage, and the lighthouse was its altar. A shriek, thin and reedy, tore through the air from the direction of the cabin, abruptly cutting off. It wasn't human. It was the sound of wood straining, of metal twisting, of something immense and hungry. Reid's blood turned to ice. He was out here, exposed, with nowhere to run. The forest, which had seemed to lead him here, now felt like a net tightening around him. He turned, desperate, scrambling back towards the perceived safety of the trees, but the path was gone. The lighthouse, which had seemed so close, now felt miles away, its sickly yellow light mocking his futile efforts. He was trapped between the unholy beacon and the ravenous cabin, his mind a fractured mess of fear and sickening revelation. His escape had failed. He was lost. The air in the cabin grew thick, tasting of old earth and something metallic, like stale blood. The sound was a roar now, like 1,000 grinding stones, or the crushing maw of something vast and indifferent. When he opened his eyes again, the cabin was gone. The scent of salt and decay filled his nostrils, sharp and biting, replacing the earthy musk of the forest. Above him, a dizzying spiral of cast iron stairs wound upwards into a gloom so profound it swallowed the faint, diffused light filtering in from unseen windows. The rhythmic crash of waves, distant but undeniable, echoed through the vast, hollow space. He was standing on a circular stone floor, worn smooth by countless forgotten footsteps, at the base of an abandoned lighthouse. Panic clawed at his throat, but beneath it, a strange, terrible certainty bloomed. This wasn't a dream. This was where he was meant to be. This was where the cabin, or whatever held it, had brought him. He took a hesitant step, his boots scraping on the grit-strewn stone. The air was frigid, raising gooseflesh on his arms, and a faint, metallic tang lingered on his tongue. He could taste the rust, the salt, the pervasive dampness that clung to every surface. A faint, almost imperceptible pulsation emanated from above, a subtle pressure against his eardrums, drawing him upwards. Each step was a creaking complaint from the ancient structure, a groan of metal against stone, echoing his own unease. The circular windows, spaced intermittently along the ascent, were choked with grime and salt spray, offering only blurred glimpses of a gray, turbulent sea and jagged, unseen rocks. The wind outside howled, a mournful, relentless cry that seemed to seep through the very walls. He climbed, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the tension in his shoulders tightening with every upward rotation. The hum returned, faint at first, then growing in intensity, a deep resonance that vibrated through the iron steps and into his bones. It was a familiar hum, the same one that had emanated from the cabin, but here, it felt amplified, raw, closer to its source. Finally, he reached the top. The lens mechanism, a monstrous contraption of pitted brass and fractured glass, sat at the center of the lantern room, shrouded in dust and cobwebs. But it wasn't entirely inert. A faint, greenish luminescence pulsed from within its depths, like a captive, dying heart. The air here was heavy, charged, prickling his skin. He peered into the shattered lens. It wasn't reflecting light, it was generating it, twisting it into distorted, fleeting images. Then, a single, terrified face, hauntingly familiar, an ancestor he'd seen in a faded photograph. The hum intensified, becoming a low, resonant drone that filled the lantern room, vibrating through the thick glass of the lens. The greenish light pulsed faster, growing brighter, until it was almost blinding. And then, it wasn't just light. It was a projection, a direct feed into his mind, bypassing his eyes, his ears, speaking directly to the deepest, most primal parts of his awareness. He saw it, the ancient, primordial entity. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but a force. A hunger. It had always been there, beneath the soil, older than the forest, older than human memory, slumbering. It fed on the land, on the life that bloomed and died above it. But it craved something more, something conscious, something that carried the spark of life and the weight of memory. A vision unfolded, brutal and clear. Generations ago, an ancestor, desperate to save their struggling community from a blight, a famine, a forgotten plague, had made a pact. Not with a benevolent deity, but with the earthbound hunger. A bargain struck in blood and fear. The entity would grant prosperity, protection, a bountiful harvest. In return, it demanded a price. Not just a life, but an unmaking. One descendant, from each generation, chosen by a subtle, insidious pull, would be offered. Their essence, their memories, their very self, would be consumed, absorbed, becoming part of the entity, sustaining its awareness, keeping its boundless hunger sated and dormant. The lighthouse, he understood now, wasn't just a beacon, it was a cage, a focal point, a temple for this terrible exchange. The chosen one was drawn here, to be unmade, to dissolve into the green light, into the consciousness of the ancient hunger. He saw the faces of those who had come before him, fleeting images of men and women, all bearing a subtle familial resemblance, all with eyes that held a dawning, terrible understanding. Their faces, once vibrant, withered and faded, their screams silent, their memories draining away like sand through an hourglass, feeding the vast, insatiable awareness that hummed within the lens. Their essence was a sacrifice, not of death, but of oblivion. The last image solidified, his own face, reflected in the emerald glow, superimposed over the fading countenances of his forebears. It was his turn. The cabin, the visions, the twisted reality, it had all been a slow, methodical drawing in, a preparation. He was the next offering. The pact demanded it. To defeat it. The thought vanished before it could even fully form, swallowed by the overwhelming presence that now claimed him. There was no defeat, only surrender, only the endless, cyclical consumption. Reid stumbled back, his hands pressed against his temples, as if he could push the terrible knowledge out. He understood. He understood the lineage, the sacrifice, the true, ancient nature of the horror that had finally claimed him. He was not just inheriting a cabin, he was inheriting a fate. And the choice, if it could even be called that, was stark: be consumed, or allow the ancient hunger to wake and devour everything he cared for. Reid squeezed his eyes shut against the building pressure, the sensation of his very skin trying to peel away from his muscles. The cabin was dissolving, not into dust, but into something formless and vast. When he opened his eyes again, the rough timber was gone. He stood on cold, damp stone, the metallic tang in the air now mixed with brine and the sharp, acrid scent of ozone. The walls, once wood, were now cyclopean blocks of granite, slick with sea spray and ancient moss. The rhythmic crash of unseen waves echoed from somewhere far below, a mournful, relentless beat. He was no longer in the cabin. He was in the abandoned lighthouse. Reid's breath hitched, a ragged sound in the cavernous space. The transition had been instantaneous, violent, leaving him disoriented and lightheaded. This was it. The entity wasn't just confined to the cabin, it was the twisting of reality itself, a malevolent consciousness that bent space to its will. He gripped the worn leather-bound journal, its pages brittle, its words the only anchor in this shifting nightmare. He had spent days poring over the fragmented entries, the desperate scrawls of his ancestors, trying to piece together the truth of the pact. He knew what he had to do. He pulled a small, tarnished silver locket from his pocket, a relic he'd found hidden in the cabin's floorboards, bearing the faded image of a woman with his eyes. His distant relative, the first sacrifice. These were the components, the keys to unlocking, or perhaps breaking, the generations-old bargain. He moved to the center of the circular room, directly beneath the spiraling steps. He could feel it watching, assessing, its patience wearing thin. This was the core, the nexus of its power. Reid laid the locket on the cold stone floor, then placed the wooden bird beside it. He uncorked the vial, his hand trembling, and poured a thin stream of his blood in a circle around the two items. And what was taken? A gust of wind, smelling of ancient decay and salt, swept through the lighthouse, though no windows were open, no doors ajar. It was an internal wind, born of the entity's fury. The moaning intensified, becoming a cacophony of wails, the voices of countless others, of those lost to the pact, echoing around him. He saw them, not with his eyes, but in the shimmering air, spectral figures, indistinct and suffering, swirling within the gloom of the upper reaches of the lighthouse. Each one a sacrifice, each one a life paid to keep the entity at bay, to maintain the illusion of prosperity for his lineage. The reveal struck him then, a sudden, horrifying clarity that slammed into his mind like a physical blow. The pact wasn't just about giving a life, it was about feeding a life. His ancestors hadn't merely appeased it, they had cultivated it, offering up their own kin as a harvest. The wealth, the stability, the very comfort of their lives had been built upon the agonizing, slow consumption of their family. He wasn't just breaking a pact, he was starving a predator that had been feasting for centuries. The stone floor beneath him began to shudder violently. Cracks spiderwebbed across the granite, glowing with the same eerie green as his blood. The spiraling steps above groaned, iron shrieking against stone. The entity was waking fully, its hunger now a palpable, crushing weight. He lifted the journal, finding the final, desperate incantation. The words were a mix of archaic English and a language he didn't recognize, etched by a hand driven to madness. He began to speak, his voice rising above the wails, above the groaning lighthouse, above the roar of the unseen sea. By the blood of the giver. By the promise broken, by the ties severed. The wooden bird in the blood circle began to twitch, then to flap its tiny, stiff wings. The silver locket glowed brighter, reflecting the swirling green light. The spectral figures above him coalesced, their forms clearer now, their faces etched with horror, reaching out with desperate, translucent hands. They were trying to warn him, or perhaps, to drag him into their eternal torment. I sever the ancient tether. You have feasted long enough. He felt a searing pain in his chest, as if a clawed hand had plunged into his ribs and was squeezing his heart. The entity was fighting back, trying to overwhelm him, to make him one of the swirling, silent sufferers above. He finished the incantation, his voice raw, hoarse. As the last word left his lips, the wooden bird burst into a shower of green sparks, and the locket flared with an blinding, emerald light. The green blood on the floor surged, forming a miniature vortex, sucking the light and the air into its swirling depths. The lighthouse shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. The stone beneath him fractured further, a yawning chasm appearing directly in front of him, glowing with an infernal green fire. The entity was recoiling, tearing itself from its ancient anchor. Reid staggered back, but the ground dissolved beneath his feet. The blinding, emerald flash had consumed everything. Reid remembered the deafening crack, like a mountain splitting, then the sickening lurch in his gut, a wrenching sensation that tore at his very being. He'd felt himself stretching, thinning, a membrane pulled taut before snapping. Then, nothing but a cold, vast emptiness. Now, he lay sprawled on a floor of rough-hewn stone, the air biting and sharp with the scent of salt and decay. A groan ripped from his throat, raw and hoarse. Every muscle screamed in protest, every joint ached with a deep, bone-wearying fatigue. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy, crusted and gritty. When he finally forced them open, a dull, gray light assaulted his vision. Above him, a spiral of rusted iron stairs climbed into the gloom, disappearing into a ceiling pockmarked with water stains. The walls were damp, streaked with dark green moss and the ghosts of peeling paint. A rhythmic thud and hiss echoed through the space, the relentless crash and retreat of waves against rock. He pushed himself up, his arms trembling, his head spinning. He was in an abandoned lighthouse. The circular room, the narrow, arched windows smeared with salt spray, the mournful groan of the wind howling through a broken pane, there was no mistaking it. How he'd arrived here, miles from the cabin and the forgotten forest, was a question that snagged at the frayed edges of his consciousness, a thought too heavy to fully grasp. He patted his pockets, a desperate, automatic gesture. His fingers brushed against torn fabric, then nothing. The locket. His hand flew to his chest, pressing against the skin beneath his shirt. It was gone. It wasn't just the loss of an object, it was a deeper, more unsettling emptiness. He tried to recall the final moments in the cabin, the spectral figures, the wooden bird's frantic wings, the swirling green light. He could see the images, stark and terrifying, but the reason for them, the sequence of events that led to the flash, remained frustratingly out of reach. It was like a word on the tip of his tongue, a name he knew but couldn't articulate. He stumbled towards a grimy window, peering out at the churning, gray sea. Waves, capped with white foam, crashed against jagged rocks far below. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken threats. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble, the grime. His fingers snagged on a raised patch of skin just above his collarbone. He pulled down the damp fabric of his shirt, craning his neck to see. There, etched faintly into his skin, was a swirling, intricate pattern. It was barely visible, a translucent whirl of lines, like a watermark on old parchment. It wasn't a scar, not exactly. It was more like a brand, a subtle inscription that hummed with a low, almost imperceptible energy. It was where the locket had rested. This was the cost, then. The locket, the tangible link to the pact, was gone, but its essence, or perhaps a fragment of the entity's power, had been transferred to him, marked him. He was not simply free, he was changed. The cabin was miles away, perhaps even obliterated by whatever force had transported him here. But in its place, he felt this new mark, a quiet, persistent hum beneath his skin. The horror wasn't gone. It had merely shifted, found a new anchor. He was the anchor now. He pressed his thumb against the faint, swirling pattern. It didn't hurt, but it felt alive. A quiet, terrifying certainty settled over him. The pact wasn't broken. It had simply evolved. The entity, whatever it truly was, had exacted its price, claimed its peace. And Reid, surviving but irrevocably altered, was left to bear the weight of its continued existence. The tension, rather than dissipating, had merely tightened, knotting itself deep within his bones. Black. He woke to the taste of metal and something else, something acrid and metallic, clinging to the back of his throat. His eyes fluttered open, refusing to focus. The world swam in a murky haze of greens and browns, the light dim and diffused, as if filtered through stagnant water. A dull throb pulsed behind his temples, mirroring the slow, heavy beat of his own heart. He was lying on something rough, damp, and smelling of decay, not the comforting scent of forest earth, but something colder, more ancient. He pushed himself up, every muscle screaming in protest. His body felt like a marionette whose strings had been stretched and reknotted by a clumsy hand. His skin was clammy, his clothes clinging to him with a thin film of moisture. The cabin. He was still in the cabin. The emerald light had ripped through him, but hadn't annihilated him. He remembered the feeling of being unmade, of his very essence dissolving into a shimmering vapor. Now, he was back, but not whole. Not truly. The cabin itself was different. The air was still thick with an unseen residue, a faint, high-pitched hum that resonated not in his ears, but in the marrow of his bones. The twisting patterns on the walls, once vibrant with malevolence, had faded to a sickly gray, like old bruises. The furniture, once contorted into grotesque shapes, had partially reverted, though still warped, frozen mid-transformation. The oppressive weight that had crushed the air for weeks was lighter now, replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness. The entity, the thing tied to the pact, was gone. Or, at least, it was no longer here. He staggered to the threshold, his legs unsteady beneath him. The forest outside was unervingly silent, the usual chorus of cicadas and rustling leaves absent. The sky was an indifferent canvas of gray, no sun, no moon, just an endless, muted expanse. He had done it. He had faced the impossible, had stood against a horror that fed on generations of blood and belief, and somehow, he had endured. The cost, however, was etched into his very being. The pact might have been broken, the immediate threat to his life averted, but the understanding that had been forced upon him, the truth of his lineage and the world's hidden machinery, was a permanent scar. He walked. He didn't know how far, or for how long. The familiar path twisted underfoot, but his perception of it was altered. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers, not threatening, but observing. He saw patterns in the bark he hadn't noticed before, intricate, almost glyph-like swirls that seemed to shift with his gaze. He now saw the world as it truly was, thin, fragile, with countless layers of reality pressed against each other, always threatening to bleed through. He felt the pull before he saw it, a strange, magnetic draw towards the distant horizon. Before him, stark against the churning gray of the sea, stood an abandoned lighthouse. Its stone tower, weathered by countless storms, rose like a sentinel from the jagged coastline. The glass of its lantern room was shattered, shards like missing teeth, and the metal catwalk rusted to a deep, earthy red. He approached it slowly, the crunch of shells and pebbles beneath his boots the only sound that broke the roar of the waves. The door, a heavy slab of rotting wood, hung ajar, groaning faintly in the sea breeze. He stepped inside. The spiral staircase, a dizzying ascent of cast iron, wound upwards into the gloom. Each step was an effort, but he pressed on, driven by an instinct he couldn't name. At the top, the wind howled through the broken lantern room, a mournful cry that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten ships and lost souls. He stood amidst the debris, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the ocean stretching out before him. The waves crashed against the rocks below, a relentless, churning white. He felt utterly insignificant, yet profoundly connected to something immense and terrifying. The pact was broken. The lineage of sacrifice, he understood now, had been an attempt to placate something that transcended human morality, something that merely was star. He had not defeated it, not truly. He had merely, through sheer desperation and an act of will he still couldn't comprehend, severed its direct tether to his family line. But the horror itself, the fundamental truth of a world far older and more predatory than he had ever imagined, remained. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, but not from fear, not entirely. It was a tremor born of fundamental change, like a tuning fork resonating with a new, unsettling frequency. He was no longer just Reid, the man who had inherited a cabin. He was Reid, the man who had seen behind the curtain, who now carried the indelible mark of what lay beyond. The world was still the world, but his perception of it was irrevocably altered. He was free, yes, but he was also a part of it now, forever attuned to its silent song.